So, Renato, now that Trump has been indicted, is he going to be like any other defendant?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down to a soundbite or a tweet.
So, Renato, just before we start, full disclosure to our listeners, in case they watch this whole pod through and notice that there's a Bollywood costume change, that we actually recorded this last Tuesday, and our first segment has been overcome by events. And so we are redoing the first segment.
That's an understatement. Yeah. I mean, what an event, right? The former president is indicted. I think that merited us getting up early and redoing this whole thing so we could get a super up-to-date podcast.
Sure. So I think it's fair to say that this took everyone by surprise yesterday. We were expecting this grand jury to basically take a vacation, and that we were going to be waiting for another few weeks at least. And Alvin Bragg got the last laugh. His office has announced that they are indicting Trump. It's under seal. Negotiations are underway for Trump to surrender himself to New York. And I believe that right now, it looks like we expect for him to be arraigned on Tuesday, and that's when we will learn what the precise charges are.
Yeah, one thing that I was asked that I don't have a good answer to, so that could probably fits into its complicated title here, is why Bragg did what he did. It's very unusual. Usually there's no like cloak and dagger stuff regarding the exact date of an indictment, unless the defendant has no idea there's an indictment, in which case it's all super secret. But this sort of thing where they say they're taking the month off and then suddenly there's an indictment 2 days later is unusual. I think it may have been motivated by security concerns. I mean, Bragg had threats and there was like some white powder sent to him. They may have been concerned about security for the grand jury or the grand jury being hassled. And this was a way of getting around that.
Getting them out of town.
Yeah. It certainly caught journalists by surprise. I think you and I both saw that firsthand, right? Right?
Yeah, I think we had heard reporting that there was an increased security presence and kind of assumed that maybe there had been another bomb threat or something like that. But yeah, I think your theory makes sense. And it is one of the ways to the question that we asked at the beginning, that this is that Trump is not an ordinary defendant. On the other hand, he is going to be booked like any person. He'll be fingerprinted. He'll get his mugshot taken. I only learned yesterday that New York does not make mugshots public. So you'll have to wait for that to be on your tote bag or whatever you're waiting to do with it.
I mean, don't you think Trump wants the mugshot to be public? I mean, there's this thing in which he relished the perp walk, right? I mean, I think he wants to be in handcuffs. He wants to be, in his mind, persecuted. I think this is all theater for him.
Well, I think it might have been in theory, but I also think at a deep level, he was absolutely terrified of being indicted. This is a man who really places a lot of weight on perception, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if he truly believes that he's in danger of being convicted. I don't know if he cares about that aspect of it. But we know from back in 2016, with Hillary under investigation, trying to get Biden to be under investigation in Ukraine, and the panic that he had when he found out that, they were investigating Russia, and he wanted Comey to announce to the public that he himself was not under investigation. He places a lot of this cloud of suspicion he thinks is, I don't know if he perceives it as weakness or automatic imputation of guilt. And I think that being charged at some level, I think he believes it that it impacts his perception, if nothing else. And I think that's why he was doing everything he could to try to derail it.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing I will say, I was responding on Twitter to Sarah Cooper, who is one of the funniest people in the world. She's the one who did those funny videos, lip syncing Trump. And she was like, "Hey, is Trump's really still not being held accountable with anything?" And I'm like, well, being indicted, particularly when you're under federal investigation and state investigation for other crimes, is actually there's definitely some serious serious downside with that. And the analogy I drew was to somebody having cancer, and that's actually the analogy that I use. Like if I'm representing a client for the first time, like they just got indicted or the FBI just visited their office or their home and they suddenly realize they're under, criminal investigation. What I usually try to explain to them is that the process is very grueling. It can just overwhelm and devastate a person. I've had clients who've thought about committing suicide before. It is just a very difficult experience. And the process of it is so challenging for most people that it's life altering and you lose part of yourself in the process. It is very, very difficult for most people. Now, Donald Trump's not, and that's why it's complicated. I suppose he's not your ordinary person. I get that this maybe have some political upside for him. I don't know. He can raise some money off of it, but I think he is still a human being, and the immense pressure and anxiety that comes with standing trial and being under indictment and being in judgment by others, I think it would affect anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing for Trump is he's now entering an arena where he no longer has control, right? And this gets to a piece I wrote earlier this week about how Trump exploits information vacuums, and he's very good in that space. He sort of engages in guerrilla warfare, information warfare, and he can put out narratives and, the justice system can't respond, or there's ways in which it can't be contradicted. Once the wheels of justice start turning, then he's in a rule-based framework, right? Like he has to speak through his lawyers. They have to file things. There are, rulings that come down from a judge. And I think we saw this play out in the Mar-a-Lago thing. I mean, it was sort of a weird, wacky attempt to derail things. But in the end, he did get some delay. But in the end, it didn't really work out the way that he wanted it to. In many ways, and more information came out that was actually very damning to him. Whereas if he had just kept his mouth shut, or not even kept his mouth shut, but just had not pushed the envelope in that way, he actually might have had more space to make his wacky claims or whatever without pushback. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a good point in that ultimately when you are under indictment, you are part of a system, and there are very good things about it. Actually, there's a slew of protections that are built into the process to help defendants ensure that they have a fair trial, for example, right? But there is a process there, and facts matter, and your behavior matters. And I get all sorts of questions from people in Trump's position, and if I'm representing them, and there's a lot of things they can't do, and there's a lot of things they can't say, and they it essentially everything that they do in their life suddenly has to get run through their criminal defense attorney, because it can have an impact on their case. For most people, it's an overriding concern. So suddenly all their business decisions, their travel decisions, where they put their money, like who they, can I help my girlfriend out with her rent? Can I, still participate in this new business I was planning to launch? Whatever it might be, suddenly everything is viewed through the lens of the criminal case. Now, Trump can try to ignore that. He could try to play by his own rules. But I think, to go to the point you were just making, Asha, for one, I think good analogy is Roger Stone, who obviously close associate of Trump's, but is also an outside the box human being, right? Who likes to break the rules, make his own rules, do crazy and wacky things. And he tried making a circus out of his whole trial and, tried to make all these public statements and try to threaten the judge and do all of this. And in the end of the day, none of that really mattered. And he ended up having to go to trial and he was convicted. I don't know what the outcome will be here, but one thing I do know for sure is, a judge is likely not going to have patience for shenanigans. And in the end of the day, the legal arguments are what's going to matter, right, not all of the theater.
I haven't been on, constantly since last night, but I don't think that Trump has pravda'd since last night or since yesterday before the indictment. I now call it pravda because I won't say truth.
I don't know if he's truth. I don't look. I only see it when people post it elsewhere, right?
Yeah, I'm not on that platform. But
I will say,
I'm just wondering if at some I don't know if his lawyers have, duct tape mittens on him or something, or taken away his phone. But you have to imagine that they're like, dude, man, this is serious. You cannot be tweeting stuff.
Yeah, I can't imagine that they're going to be able to accomplish that, which makes him such a difficult client. I mean, it's so different than a typical case. I mean, first of all, it's fair to say he doesn't have a legal team up to this task of trying to defend multiple indictments or potentially multiple indictments, likely multiple indictments, but certainly multiple criminal investigations and now one indictment. But separate from that, usually you would have all of that button down. You'd have the defendant saying nothing. The only statement would be through his attorneys. And we had, even the night of the indictment, right, a quote statement by Trump, like the statement from the 45th president sort of thing, blasting Bragg. And so, yeah, I think that's going to happen. And it'll be interesting to see whether it has an impact in this trial. I mean, I think, one thing is for certain, that he is already using this and is focused on how it helps him in the Republican primary, and it very well may help him there.
I think that that's another spin that we need to examine critically. Trump likes to say things and make them true in the process of saying it, right? I remember before the 2020 election, I was like, don't accept the premise and don't, create the outcome that he wants by buying into what he's doing. I think that to be honest, there might be this 20 to 30% diehard MAGAs, but I think most people, I like my presidential candidates when they're not indicted. I think that's really how most people feel. And it's embarrassing, I think, to have, a person accused, unless you are absolutely, convinced of his innocence. I think that this will be damaging to him. And I think that's partly why he's so terrified about it. This is only, by the way, the first of many to come, in my opinion. The ball is rolling, or whatever. The snowball has started rolling and gaining momentum. I don't know what metaphor I'm using anymore, but, the Florida, the Mar-a-Lago, the January 6th. And as you get closer and closer, if he's under, if he's been charged in 3 different jurisdictions, for 4 different sets of crimes, then that's a problem. And I think you also mentioned the logistical problems in that great Politico piece that you put out yesterday.
Yeah. So, I did talk about that in that column. So, one thing that I have some experience with is defending clients who are facing criminal charges in multiple states, and also just defending clients who have criminal investigations in multiple jurisdictions. And it is really, 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 really hard. It's harder than you might think because, a prosecutor, let's say Alvin Bragg in this case, him and his team can be laser focused on getting a conviction. Their entire consideration is, will this motion, will this argument, will this piece of evidence help me get a conviction in this case? The defense in Trump's case won't be able to be focused on getting a win in that case, which often requires you to be very aggressive and agile and doing all sorts of shenanigans on your side and the defense side to get a win. Instead, they're going to have to be playing a kind of 3D chess. I mean, what you have to do if you have multiple cases that you're facing is you have to consider for every statement you make, motions you file, thing you do, you have to consider how does this impact all these other cases at the same time? And it can have a significant impact. I mean, the timing of cases, like you want to have your weak cases go first. And if you have a conviction in one case, that could be used against you. In the other cases, it could preclude you from testifying. If you get anything you say in the first case, anything you file, whether it's certainly any of his words, Trump's words can be used against him. But even the filings, if you take an inconsistent position in case 2 or 3, the judges are going to certainly point out the fact that you actually took the opposite position previously. It's just very hard. And usually when I have clients in that situation, I'm trying to resolve cases. I'm trying to do everything I can to get it down to the fronts that really matter. And you often have to essentially concede certain cases because you just can't defend everything at once. And so I do think Trump is in a very bad spot, and he's in a much worse place than he was legally yesterday, the day before the morning before the indictment. Even regardless, even if he wins the Manhattan case, I think he's still a loser from a legal perspective.
Yeah, and you actually think this is the weakest of all the cases. And so it sounds like from what you are saying, it actually is good that it goes first. From a prosecutor's point of view. That's
right. However, I mean, so it's an interesting thing. I mean, R. Kelly was in a similar situation where the New York feds charged him in Brooklyn with a criminal case that was very bizarre. It was like they made it a RICO case. It was just a very they had to charge it in a bizarre way to get venue in New York for crimes that occurred in like California and Illinois and elsewhere. And it was a head scratcher case, but they won anyway. I mean, they went first and they won anyway. But he was facing like 4 other criminal cases at the same time, and he was just kind of boxed in. I think for Trump, if you're on Trump's legal team, you have to think to yourself, well, this is the weakest case. But because of that, there's all sorts of interesting challenges that we could bring, like some of the ones, Asha, that you and I've talked about in prior episodes, right? We talked about potential preemption and, there's these, novel theories. I mean, they could bring all sorts of legal arguments and potentially appeal this before trial and stretch out that case. But if they, let's say, are indicted in the Mar-a-Lago case or in Fulton County or so on, they don't want to, those cases might speed the trial comparatively. So usually what you do is, if you're the defense, is you have this 2-step you play, where in the one case that you want to go slow, you're like, oh, there's so much discovery and we need more time to review it. And you file 100 motions. And in the other case, you're like, I want my speedy trial, right? In a different state. So it's an interesting thing. I think he's going to end up delaying everywhere, which maybe in his perceived political situation, maybe in his political advantage, but I don't think is necessarily the smartest legal strategy. But that's not what his lawyers are usually known for.
Yeah. And, it'll be really interesting to see how the charges are framed when they come out, in terms of, using what comes out in the Manhattan case and other cases. I mean, this was sort of the OG, of attempt to cheat in the election, right? And I'm wondering, can that be used later by Fani? Like, in other words, if he is convicted, right, of let's say this comes out as conspiracy to commit an election campaign finance violation, can that be relevant to, like, you already tried to, you already engaged in a conspiracy to cheat in this other election so that you could mislead voters, et cetera, et cetera. Does that become relevant in the Fulton County case?
Well, it's 100% relevant if he takes the stand, even if he gets convicted of the misdemeanor, because it's a misdemeanor that involves dishonesty. So at least under the federal rules, I'm not an expert on the Georgia rules of evidence, but federal rules of evidence, he would be that would be permitted for impeachment purposes, which would essentially mean that he couldn't take the stand. And it's a situation, by the way, that R. Kelly was in, situation that Avenatti was in, situation Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein. Like, a lot of defendants are in a situation where once you have one conviction, you basically can never take the stand in a subsequent case. And that can matter. I mean, in R. Kelly's federal case in Chicago, one of his co-defendants got off completely. And others, there was a number of charges that were not guilty verdicts in that case. But R. Kelly couldn't take the stand without question, right? Because the first question would be, you're actually convicted of running a criminal enterprise to, abuse children, right? So it would have just been devastating for him. And so I do think it would handcuff him completely in that proceeding.
Yeah. Outside of that, can it come in any way, you think, or no?
No, it couldn't come in otherwise, unless it was like there has to be a motion under at least the federal rules. It's Rule 404B to let in a prior bad act. It has to come in not for
it's very stringent,
but for some other purpose. But just for what it's worth, I mean, there can be pieces of what he said and what he did that can come in, and all of that. That's the problem for him, is that, if you're a prosecutor in Fulton County, you're reading these transcripts and mining them for nuggets. You're looking for little things that you could pull out that move the ball forward for you in ways that you and I can't even anticipate, because we're not that much in the weeds in the legal proceedings there. And they'll do the same thing with legal positions. They'll be, telling that, using all of that to tell the judge, well, hey, Trump said this and that about discovery in that case, or whatever the issue is. So one thing I do think is worth talking about, Asha, is this business about the number of counts. CNN had a report that he's facing like 30 something counts. We don't
34.
know as of the time of this recording. That may be outdated by the time you're listening to this. I don't know how much it matters. I think this discussion is still fascinating, because supposedly he's facing 30 something counts, and people are like, okay, does that mean that he's buried? Is that super serious? And the answer is actually no. And we're going to get very real here. Is that, the number of counts in a case really does not directly correlate with the seriousness of the case, because prosecutors can do all sorts of things to turn one crime into many different counts. And it happens on a fairly regular basis. I never did this myself. In fact, I was very big when I was a prosecutor and having my cases very streamlined and very narrow. But there's a lot of prosecutors who will take, let's say, one pattern of bribery. Like, let's say somebody, shakes down somebody for bribes. Well, what they'll do is they'll take every payment, every check that's written as part of that, and make it a separate count. Does that mean it's more serious? Like, it's actually just one shakedown, but like, if you turn every check into a separate thing, and then what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, every check was, a wire fraud and a bank fraud or something, or something like that. So they'll take the same check and they'll charge it 3 different ways. But like, really, you could have just chosen 3 of the checks at random and put them in, because ultimately the jury either is convinced he's a fraudster or not, or convinced it's bribery or not. But what they'll do is sort of turn it into more than that. And the theory is that it's hard for, and I think it's right, that it's hard, this part is right, is that it's hard for a jury to check off on their verdict form, not guilty, like 33 times in a row.
Yeah, this feels like a psychological tactic in a way. And it's also, I mean, it impacts the perception of the public, right? I mean, imagine this indictment unsealed on Tuesday, and it's like, Trump charged with 34 counts of, whatever, or 15 counts of this and, 14 counts of that. That is psychologically, cognitively, it makes it seem like he was doing a lot of criming.
100%. and that's why it's done that way. It can backfire for prosecutors, by the way, if you have very little evidence. And what I mean by very little evidence is sometimes your evidence is super rock solid, but there's just two witnesses. There's like the guy who was bribed, and there's the recording or something. It's just you have three actual exhibits in your case, right? Or something like that. Hey, we just got the drugs. Like we got the drugs and the confession or something. But it's like, wow, there's 33 counts and we were only here for 2 days, right? It can seem incongruent. There's lots of psychological things you have to take into account in terms of how it actually plays out. But yeah, I mean, this is a case that was going to be complicated, even if there was just one count, right? And we've been discussing this for weeks, right? All the ways in which, all the various things you're going to have to prove up in order to get to a felony conviction here. And so having the number of counts matches that. And like you said, adds to the weight of it. But, just for our listeners who are super savvy, they're savvy enough to want to listen to a podcast for a long time to understand this in a complicated way. Doesn't impact the sentence. Generally doesn't impact, it doesn't indicate seriousness. So
the counts don't impact the sentence?
No, I mean, the crime impacts the sentence. In other words, for example, if you're convicted if you're charged and convicted of a particular type of crime, that does impact the sentence. But usually, it doesn't impact the sentence if you're convicted of, let's say, 5 counts of fraud versus 1.
Is that if it's arising out of the same set of facts? Like I would think that somebody who bribed one person, even, and if maybe they pay them 10 checks or whatever, and you're saying, okay, those are really the same crime. But if they bribe one person and then also bribe another person, that should be more serious than bribing just the one person. And if that was all included in the same
count. Right. So you can have a count that's like scheme to defraud. And the scheme to defraud is that Asha Rangappa defrauded, a whole host of people, as part of her fraud scheme.
Fox News is going to cut that and air it somewhere.
Oh, no. Probably. And some people on the internet, right? Or on right. Twitter. Yeah. So, but you get the idea. Okay. We'll make it Pancake. So Pancake, defrauds 14 different people as part of his fraud scheme. You can have that in one count, and often you do. I mean, you'll have, in fact, like in federal. I mean, I don't know New York law as well. In federal sentencing, you can have Pancake with 14, victims, 140 victims, and so the modifier in the sentencing is number of victims, loss amount. What's the total loss? It's not how many counts. And the reason it's done that way specifically and purposely is to prevent prosecutors from playing games. They do not want sentencing control by prosecutors. And so, by the way, that also can sometimes mean that prosecutors will put all sorts of circumstances in front of the judge that they didn't charge, or sometimes that the person was even acquitted by, and the judge can make, acquitted because the standard is so high, and the judge can make a finding by a preponderance. Like, hey, January 6th isn't in front of me, but I care about it anyway. And I'm going to take that into account. It probably won't work that way in Manhattan. I mean, from what I'm hearing from my friends in Manhattan is that this is the sort of case that often would not get a prison sentence in New York. But
that was my understanding.
Yeah. But nonetheless, I don't think even there the number of counts would drive things, because prosecutors can play so many games with the number of counts.
By the way, fun fact. And I know this from a talk that I gave on, the relationship between the prosecutorial function and the executive branch, is that since 2000, former leaders in 76 different countries have been prosecuted or jailed. Wow,
that is a fun fact. I thought you were going to tell me something about Pancake committing fraud. So it's
no, he commits fraud. It's just an ongoing fraud scheme over here to get treats. But
in all seriousness, no, that is something.
I thought that was an interesting thing, and I posted it on Twitter. It's an interesting map, and it includes democracies like France and South Korea. So it was just an interesting thing, because I know that people are like, "This is a third world country." and it's not necessarily true. I think it's a matter of perspective. It's also a place where rule of law is upheld, and no one's above the law.
100%. I mean, I was just going to say that, if you're not prosecuted, let's say Russia, that could just mean that, that could just mean that they don't, that it's totally acceptable there. Right. Or, no one gets brought to justice. So no, I think it's a good thing. I will say it was funny for me to see Rod Blagojevich on Fox News last night, defending Trump, the guy who had, I think, what did he commute his sentence? But a guy who I literally watched him on trial. But he shook down a children's hospital and did all sorts of dastardly things, and was prosecuted and convicted here in Illinois. And by the way, there's like a huge public corruption trial right now going on in Chicago. And I'll just say that Trump. One thing, the reason I'm mentioning that is because Trump does not stand alone as the only corrupt person here. And that what's at stake in terms of our system is much greater than just Trump. And one point that I've tried to make to people is that what Trump is doing to try to suggest that the system is rigged, that the system is wrong, that the system doesn't work, which fraudsters like Rod Blagojevich are fine latching onto, hurts all of us, regardless of your political orientation or nothing else, because that is what polices our system. That's what makes us not a third world country, is having people being able to be brought to justice, no matter how powerful they are, whether they're the governor or the president.
I'm so glad you bring that up, because I wrote a piece a while back when he was on his pardon spree, where I said, take a look at the crimes that he pardons, because it gives you a window into how much contempt he has for the rule of law and for due process. His first pardon was, I think, Joe Arpaio, who he pardoned for, who had been convicted criminal contempt of court. This is for defying the court's authority. Later pardons were, Scooter Libby, obstruction of justice, people who make false statements, all of these people who try to thwart the integrity of the functioning of the justice system, which I think he hates those rules, right? And it was denigrated as these are just process crimes. The process crimes are what allow this whole system to function. The substantive stuff, we matter too. But if you can't make sure that people don't lie, that they obey the authority of the court, that they don't tamper with witnesses, that they don't destroy evidence, you're never going to be able to bring those cases in the end. And I think it's just really interesting. I just mentioned that because you mentioned Rod Blagojevich, because he was another one that I think really was a psychological window for Trump.
Yeah, he, by the way, was very Trumpy in a lot of ways. He was somebody who made tons of public statements while he was in his criminal case. In fact, he used to joke every time he appeared on a late night talk show, he would get a videotape from my colleagues of his appearance as evidence in the case. And he also was somebody who came in and tried to talk his way out of it. And actually, one of his first crime of conviction in his first trial was on false statements. It was what Trump has called a process crime, right? Because he was willing to go in and try to lie to the FBI in order to get out.
Oh, lying to Congress, Roger Stone.
Yeah, there you go. And
pardon him for that. So he's all, and it's a signal also for people who are in his circle, like, you help me out and I'll make sure you're okay. Of course, that's not going to help him in the New York case, but.
Yeah, well, speaking of helping out, I thought it was interesting. I'm sure you saw, Asha, the statement by Ron DeSantis that they're not, Florida's not going to help get him out. If Trump doesn't go up to Manhattan, we're not helping the state of New York get him up there, right?
Yeah, and people were like, "What does this mean?" And does that mean that marshals are going to have to go down and will he be a fugitive from justice? But I think, first of all, he's going to surrender himself. So I think this is a very convenient way for Ron DeSantis to make a lot of big, bold claims that he's not going to have to back up with action. Second, he's required by the Constitution to present Trump if New York requests it, and he's been, indicted by due process and all of that. But third, if we might as well imagine the hypothetical, the legal hypothetical, since, with Trump, you never know, it could come to pass. My thought was that the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction for disputes between states, and that in such a case, New York could go directly to the Supreme Court and ask for a writ of mandamus, which is an order from the court directing the state of Florida to deliver Trump. That's what I think would happen.
Yeah, and that sounds about right. It's something you've thought more about than me. I mean, one thing I do know is for sure is that very practically that there's no way that Florida would be able to do that legally, just for the reasons you said in the Constitution. My take on it was that, like you said, Ron DeSantis is trying to make himself the center of attention, trying to get a headline for himself in something, like you said, that he would never have to do. And Trump would never want to put him in that position. Trump would not want to have the
limelight go to somebody else.
Right. And the narrative be that he's hiding in Florida, protected by Ron DeSantis. Like he's a little boy under Ron DeSantis's protective wing. Like that's never going to happen. And his lawyers would tell him like that. Maybe if that was a way out of it, like if he could just chill out in Florida the rest of his life, maybe. But that's not. That's not the reality anyway. Never going to happen.
Yeah, I wish the Lincoln Project would come out with a quick ad calling him Wimpy Don. Wimpy Don needs Ron to help him and protect him. That would drive him nuts, I think.
Probably, which is why
he'd be on a jet to New York like tomorrow.
Yeah, right. But that one thing that people have asked is like how all of that works, and we should just kind of circle back to that a little bit. I mean, it is not at all unusual, the fact that he is, still a free man and out there, and there's conversations between him and his attorneys to figure out when he's going to report, and he'll just show up for his court date, not in handcuffs but in a suit. Like that's all very normal, and that's just how things roll. We've talked a little bit about that in the past, but the questions are escalating on that front now that it's reality. By the way, one thing I'm curious about, Asha, I have been seeing for days, weeks now, lots of people in my comments saying like, "Oh, this is never going to really happen." Indictments never actually happen. So, what happens to those people? Like, do they like suddenly change their tune?
I know. I felt like bookmarking, some of those and coming back. I don't know. I think they just moved the goalpost, and they're like, he'll never be convicted. He'll never go to trial before the election. It's always they're the Eeyore reply guys, like downers.
Yes.
On everything.
In terms of being a downer, I do think this is a very difficult day to be Donald Trump. None of you should envy him. This is not a good thing. There's no way to spin it as like this is a great development for him. Certainly legally, it's a disaster. And it is going to be a very difficult process ahead. And we'll be here to follow it.
Yeah. And I'll just add, if I could give my closing thoughts, that, I'm happy that he is being held to account, because we've watched a lot of stuff happen over the last 6 years. But in a lot of ways, this is sad. We have, as a country, truly tried to avoid being in this situation. And even after Nixon stepped down, Ford, in considering whether to pardon Nixon, really thought about what it would put the country through to have Nixon face criminal charges and go through that trial. And, I think we have a long road ahead, just as a country to, as this process unfolds. And in that way, I don't think that it is, a happy time.
Yeah. And I'm concerned about the impact that it has and how people view the justice system in the long run, which is so important, not just for cases like this one, but for all cases all across the country where we're trying to bring people to justice, including corrupt politicians. So, Asha, while we've been focused, our eyes have been gazed on Manhattan. It's sort of like, the
Eye of Sauron.
Yeah, Sauron's over here, and then Frodo's like sneaking up. Okay, so Frodo's sneaking up, and he's the actual threat is like coming from a different angle
up the back of the hill. Yeah,
there you go. So in the back of the hill, Jack Smith is trying to get Mark Meadows to the lava pit or whatever. If he can toss Mark Meadows
who's Gollum in this situation? Tell me it's Donald Trump.
Yeah, right. Or yeah, maybe it's Alan Dershowitz. Anyway. So in any event, in all seriousness, there's a very important ruling in Jack Smith's special counsel investigation, which I think is pretty consequential, very much expected, which is an executive privilege ruling that said that all of these top presidential aides, including Mark Meadows, can testify before the grand jury. There's an override of the executive privilege claims that were raised by Trump and by those individuals, I think, on his behalf. It's important because, the chief of staff is always the gatekeeper to the president. But with this president in particular, there was some great testimony on this from Cassidy Hutchinson to the January 6th committee, because she worked for Mark Meadows, about how Trump didn't use texts and emails. And so everyone was contacting Mark Meadows to get to Trump. And so Mark Meadows really knows everything that was going on here. And in many ways, if he was forced to testify and be honest, he really could bury Trump potentially.
Yeah, he is in the center of my coup chart.
Oh wow!
Mm-hmm.
For people who are listening to this while they're driving or working out, and they're like, "What's the coup? What is a coup chart? Can you please explain that?"
Well, I made this hub and spoke chart with all of the different pieces of the January 6th conspiracy, really, and kind of all of these things that are happening at the same time, and why they really all emanate from this middle. The hub is Mark Meadows and John Eastman. I think that what you're saying, and because we are talking about a conspiracy, and a conspiracy is an agreement, it's why these communications become so important. And, I'm actually thinking about doing an executive privilege chart, maybe as a board game.
A board game?
You land. Yeah, well, you land on a square and it's like, are you the president? No, you can't claim executive privilege. Go directly to the courthouse. Does this concern core Article 2 functions? No, this is about a presidential campaign. Go directly to the courthouse. So, I think that in that way, Mark Meadows and all of these other people, Trump tries to use these privileges, these cones of silence, I call them, whether it's attorney-client privilege, executive privilege, where he thinks he's going to be protected in these communications. And so, as you said, it's very significant because this is really piercing that veil of secrecy and getting to what was being said and who said what to whom and what was being agreed upon.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I think one thing that I'm very curious about is, what is Mark Meadows doing? So, we talked about how Trump's got these oddball attorneys or people who are definitely not within the mainstream. That Mark Meadows is not in that same camp. Mark Meadows has a really good attorney, very savvy white collar criminal attorney, which really is interesting because that person's going to be thinking about it the way I am. Okay. He's going to be thinking about this as sort of, he's playing chess, Meadows' attorney, which is, by the way, why Meadows didn't get charged for contempt of Congress, right? He, that lawyer, I think, positioned that very carefully. So, if you're on Team Meadows and you're a smart lawyer, you're thinking to yourself well, okay, he's got to testify, but I'm going to assert the fifth. And then what does Jack Smith do? What's Jack Smith's move? Jack Smith could give him use immunity, and force him to testify. Separately, you could strike some sort of deal with Smith on the front end and say, okay, my guy will testify, but I want immunity in exchange for his testimony. I want letter immunity, which is where there's a letter agreeing that my office, the special counsel's office, is going to prosecute you. or what I'll call what we sometimes call transactional immunity, where you go to a court and the court's like, no one can prosecute you for what you say. That is the end game I would want if I was the guy, which I'm not, representing Meadows. And Meadows' attorney is very capable. He's thinking a lot of the same things. Generally, that is a win for a client. Immunity is like, my clients are very happy to pay my bills if that's the end result, right? That's good. But for Meadows, that may be bad because that may end his career in Republican politics. So it'll be interesting. There's very unusual circumstances at play here that might mean that Meadows wants to, take the fifth, be compelled to testify, and then say very little and be combative in the grand jury. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I mean, he is really at the epicenter of this, and I would think, is very likely to have criminal liability of his own.
Oh, Meadows? Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, that's why asserting the fifth is an obvious choice for him, is that if Jack Smith's clearly going after Trump, and whatever Trump did, whatever criminal liability Trump had, very likely Meadows was part of that because he was working with Trump and aiding Trump and agreeing to do things with Trump. And so it's possible that Meadows didn't, but it would be hard to imagine that Meadows wouldn't get caught up in that, because when you know about criminal activity and you help to make it succeed in some way, you are guilty of that same crime. And so Meadows, of course, his whole job was helping Trump do things. And based on the accounts we heard in the January 6th committee, including from Cassidy Hutchinson, it sure didn't seem like Mark Meadows was pushing back on anything. At best, he was sort of like passive, like just sort of watching it all happen, drinking his whiskey or whatever. I mean, I'm just metaphorically, of course. But, it's also very likely that he was helping Trump in some way, given his position and his role.
Yeah. And I mean, Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony suggested that he was actually in contact with people in the so-called war room. These were like Steve Bannon and Giuliani. And those guys were much more intimately connected with the people who were showing up that day, including many of the people who became violent. And so he's also a potential conduit to what did they know in advance about the violence that was going to take place, the premeditated violence.
Yeah. In a criminal case like this, what are the best situations you could be in as a person who didn't really know much? If you were around criminal activity while it was afoot and you really were not clued in, like you just happened to be at the drive-in when the drug deal was going down or something like that, that's fine. But like if you're super clued in on everything, that's generally a bad thing for you. And that's the unfortunate position that Meadows is in. And he's also in an unfortunate position where, where one of the people who is closest to him has really put out her testimony in a very comprehensive way. And I think she's quite credible. She has a lot less at stake. And I just think a jury would find her very credible. And that puts Meadows in a tough spot because she's not sort of coordinating her story with him or anything like that either. And so he's definitely in a challenging position. I think it's so fascinating. I think this is a really interesting situation.
And let's not forget that speaking of cones of silence, John Eastman already, a judge ruled that he had to turn over his emails and communications that he had asserted were protected by attorney-client privilege. And he is under Jack Smith's microscope also. And both of those two are central players in this.
Without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, and of course we also had the recent, I mean, it's crazy to me that you had two attorneys, both have the crime fraud exception invoked to get their communications with Trump. I mean, that I literally have never seen a prosecutor.
The other one Renato's referring to is Evan Corcoran in the Mar-a-Lago case.
Right. And I think, did we discuss that in the last podcast?
We did discuss it last week, but just in case people can't keep track of all of the lawyers that are also criminals.
Yes. Or you didn't listen last week's episode worth listening to. But yeah, I've never seen that in my career. And literally, I've been talking to a lot of, ever since this happened, that this has been like a topic of chatter amongst criminal defense attorneys. We're all like, yeah, prosecutors talk about it, but they never actually do it. So difficult. And so it is crazy. And yeah, I do. We still don't know 100% what's in those emails, right? Between Eastman and Trump. So could be very interesting stuff there. Clearly stuff that moved Judge Carter quite a bit.
So, Renato, before we go, I know that Pancake has been, making his cameos, but we haven't seen a lot of Henry. What's happening with him?
Well, Henry is almost not a puppy. Okay. He is like getting close to 2 years and he is changing. I mean, he is becoming a little man. So Henry's all business now. Henry comes into my office. He wants to get a pet, and then he dashes off like he's got a business meeting to go to. He's got something else to do. I don't know if anyone else has a dog like this, but my dog is like very busy. Okay, so he's like, he'll be playing with me, and then he'll run downstairs because he's got to see what's going on, making sure like no one's attacking our home.
He's busy.
And then he runs back up. Like he's got a lot going on. So Henry is occasionally present, but he's unless there's some treat involved or something like that, like he's got a lot of angles that he's working. So I don't know. It's an interesting thing. My wife's kind of sad because he's not like her little puppy anymore. I think it's great. He's like a little man. Like we're going to dress him up for Halloween as a businessman. He's definitely.
I love that. So what happens when he grows up? What does he want to be when he grows up?
It's a good question. I do think that no matter treats are definitely involved in some way. But he's definitely, I think I could see him as a criminal defense attorney. He's like very sly and he's very persuasive. Very good at getting his own way. And he's got that
kind of down home look to, get the jury sympathy,
Yes, he's totally
like I'm just one of y'all.
Yes, he's totally worked over my wife, who's sort of like the abused younger associate who follows him to court. So he basically follows her around and like barks at her all day of things that he wants and whatever. So he works her over, and then he occasionally has other angles. So he's like, okay, she's out of treats or whatever, whatever he's trying to get out of her, and so then he's trying to, he's working over my stepdaughter or me or passersby or whatever he can get to try to work out his situation, but very crafty dog.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of Henry, and if he were making an argument, I would completely believe anything he said.
There you go. He's ready for his own law practice.
MSW Media.